Hello everyone, Remix Review Guy here. I review remixes. It's 2025 and for my first album review of the year I am starting off the same way that I ended 2024, behind schedule. I spent December blasting through a bunch of reviews of albums from last year that I thought were notable, and as of New Year's Eve I had cleared everything from my backlog. Almost. You may not have heard of Northern Irish queercore punk band Problem Patterns, even though they've received plaudits from Bikini Kill lead singer Kathleen Hanna and Black Flag grumpkin Henry Rollins. Their 2023 debut album Blouse Club combined righteous fury with a smattering of silliness in order to discuss issues surrounding class, gender, sexuality, healthcare, and the nuances of throwing underwear at gigs.
I don't want your pity, bruh.
And in October 2024 they dropped a full remix companion to this album titled Blouse Clubland. I was originally just going to cover this in brief as part of my epic reviews I missed video at the end of the year, but the more I listened to both the original album and the remix version, I thought it was way too interesting to not dedicate a full video to. Even though I suspect this is not going to be one of my most well watched videos, but honestly, I just need a break from reviewing pop music made by men for a bit. Seriously, even the production team on Brat was mostly a sausage fest. But also, Blouse Clubland links with some contemporary musical themes I've wanted to discuss for a while now. In particular, the role of punk music as a political tool in 21st century, and ways in which the form can evolve in the post-genre era of stylistic fluidity. First things first though, I need to see if I can actually join the club. I usually find arguments about what genre a piece of music or a band is to be rather tedious, but there's one thing that really bothers me about modern musical discourse. No one seems to know the difference between punk and post-punk. Hell, at this point I'm not even sure I do. My general reference point was always via John Lydon's two bands. The Sex Pistols were punk, Public Image Limited were post-punk. Punk was about a back-to-basics, straight-talking approach to rock and roll. The instrumentation was more scuzzy, more primitive, less polished, a standard guitar, bass and drums as the setup, and the lyrical content offered pretty direct, or at least bluntly sarcastic commentary on socio-political issues, with the occasional love song thrown in to show that they were human. Post-punk, meanwhile, was an evolution that said, look, this DIY approach is all well and good, but I like other music as well, like reggae and krautrock and disco and afrobeat. It basically added an experimental twist, often involving compositional quirks, electronic instruments, studio trickery. The vocals were still angry, but often in more expressive ways, and the lyrics were generally a bit more abstract. It's not an exact distinction by any stretch. The Stranglers used a lot of unusual instrumentation, for example, yet I've almost never heard them referred to as post-punk. But for me, the two phases of Lydon have generally worked as a good guideline. Fast forward to the 2020s and it seems like post-punk now refers to a somewhat different sound. Too polished, apolitical and frankly middle class to be punk, but too musically straight-laced and incurious to fit in with the innovative post-punk of the 70s and 80s. It just seems like a slightly more surrealist variant of modern indie rock. But even though I've historically been much more of a fan of post-punk, it now seems like more of a compliment to be referred to as punk. Problem Patterns, as far as I'm concerned, are very much a punk band. It might not be obvious from the Art Deco cover of their debut album, Blouse Club, but that's half the fun of album covers. Sometimes they deliberately go against what the music actually sounds like. In an interview, the band talk about how Northern Ireland in particular has had something of a pedigree in punk bands over the years due to its somewhat turbulent political history. And in terms of modern examples of that spirit, you could also cite Kneecap, who've been applying that punk ethic to a more genre-hopping hip-hop palette. But sonically at least, Problem Patterns offer something a little more traditional. They've got the standard guitar, bass, drums and vocals set up. Lyrically, their themes are very direct. And to be honest, there's very little genre cross-pollination going on here. The closest you get is on the opening track YAW, which, with its measured drums and big drony guitars, has something of a doom metal feel to it.
With a sense of humor is
closing track, Domestic Bliss, offers a similar vibe, being a slow, brooding number that eventually speeds up and climaxes by sticking a hoover in your face. But this track is an outlier, not just stylistically, but also lyrically, as it's one of the only times where problem patterns are verbally both brief and metaphorical. In most of the tracks on Blouse Club, they are painfully but necessarily direct, largely avoiding sloganeering in favour of telling you exactly what their problem is with you. Like on YAW, where they rally against the men who help perpetuate a culture where women are disposable, and not metaphorically disposable, literally disposable.
Do you like women, or do you like power?
The theme of criticising male behaviour continues on the next few tracks, with Big Shouty and The History of Bad Men Part 2. This time taking umbrage with more specific men they've encountered, particularly those who have patronised, demeaned, or even attacked them as a band. Although they do permit themselves a more sweeping critique towards the end of the latter track. I mean, I run this channel, I can't really argue with that. Also, if you're looking to defend yourself with a hashtag not all men, they already called you out in track 1.
Devil's advocate wants to come out again, 'cause he'd like to tell women that it's not all men.
You've also got Lesbo 3000, where they furiously list the stereotypes of lesbians that still get trotted out in 2024 on a regular basis.
Nothing in your jeans can change me. There's no magic cure, 'cause it's not a fucking disease.
These are topics that have been part of rebellious, aggressive, socially conscious music for decades now, but given the lack of progress that humanity chooses to make on this front, it seems like said critiques are still very much needed. Although if you're looking for a more contemporary concern, then you've got Turfs Out, in which problem patterns turn the crosshairs on so-called feminist allies who see fit to throw trans women under the bus in order to fulfill their own self-serving agenda.
Standing with your oppressors will not make you more free.
Yeah, if you couldn't tell by now, this album is a little bit confrontational. But I'd argue there are numerous aspects of it that make it an easier pill for the uninitiated to swallow. For starters, problem patterns definitely aren't averse to a good driving riff. Occasionally there's some neat melodies on this album, like the main refrain of Advertising Services. Mostly though, it's just those Moorish waves of guitar that you get in prime 70s punk. The ones that sound like they're actively trying to pin you up against the wall and threaten you with a fatal wedgie. The pace varies quite a bit on this album as well. Consider the urgently paced Who We Do Not Save, which furiously laments the increasing privatisation of effective healthcare.
We get stuck on waiting lists while those of our answer.
Whilst the following track, Poverty Tourist, takes an appropriately more measured strut to sock it to rich kids who affect a poor aesthetic to seem cool. And then a song like A History of Bad Men 2 takes a pretty languid pace to underline the lyrical content, as if to say, God, we're bored of this bullshit. Problem Patterns mention in an interview that they all have day jobs alongside the band, which is increasingly a reality for any non-nepo baby looking to make it in music or any of the arts for that matter. And certainly many of the lyrics here feel like they were written by a group of people utterly narked off by the 9-to-5 daily grind. Case in point, the track Letter of Resignation, which is actually a song about leaving the church. But presented here in the guise of storming out of a job you hate and telling your boss to shove it. Or there's Advertising Services, which reads very much like someone who's had to put up with a lot of faux matey corporate speak in their day job.
Do you want to see improvements? Are you ready for a taste of success?
Ultimately though, what makes Problem Patterns appealing as a band is that behind all the acerbic messaging, they kind of seem fun. It's not always that explicit in their songwriting, with the exception of Pity Bra, a whimsical little spoken word story about an underwear throwing incident at a Sleater Kinney gig.
Then Carrie asked why she never gets underwear thrown at her like the old rock stars. When someone offered to oblige, she said, I don't want your pity bra.
But there's an underlying silliness to the band that stops any of these songs feeling like a joyless lecture. They sound like they mean business, but in the same way that the Powerpuff Girls mean business. So yeah, Blouse Club, good album. Very much recommend this record if you like Writer's Fury and stripped down DIY rock form. Me being me though, I generally prefer a broader musical palette, so theoretically a remix album of this project is very much up my street. And yet, something I've started to notice with post-punk and its descendants is that when the musical innovation starts getting cranked up, there's a risk that the fundamental message of the song can get a little obfuscated. Part of the reason that punk adopted such a stripped-down rock aesthetic was to ensure that the timely, urgent commentary of the lyrics were up front and centre. You start throwing in synthesizers, electronics, drum machines, a harp, brass section. There's a risk that all of that starts going out the window. Right? I realised recently what one of my holy grails for music would be. If someone could get me the direct political anger of punk vocals and match it up to the musical experimentation of post-punk, I think I'd be set for life. Maybe this new fusion could have a new name, like post-punk, or, I don't know, something actually good. I think this unreasonable desire of mine is why I've been fascinated by remixes of punk songs for decades now. I remember the first one I ever bought back in 2002 on 7-inch vinyl. Granted, it doesn't work as a remix at all, but I felt genuinely excited by it for a few minutes because I actually thought it was gesturing towards new territory for punk that I hadn't heard before. And a short 21 years later, we finally got a proper electro-punk fusion sticking it to the Royals.
I like big boots, so I can stamp on the heads of the monarchy.
Oof, steady on, Grove. Now, I've heard a whole bunch of remix projects of Bandcamp punk bands in the last year, many of which go vastly off script as far as punk goes, but none of them have felt as unified as a statement as Blouse Clubland. As remix albums go, this one reminds me of Charlie XCX's Still Brat for a few reasons. Firstly, it's a track-by-track remix of the entire original album, no track left behind. Secondly, all of the remixes are credited as features rather than remixes, which I guess is just a thing now. And thirdly, unlike most of my reviews, I am largely going to be avoiding a deep dive into the oeuvre of the remixers here. With Still Brat, I didn't bother with any particularly deep discog dives because most of the remixers were too famous to bother covering. With Blouse Clubland though, it's the opposite issue. Problem Patterns have basically farmed out their songs to a whole bunch of largely very obscure artists, mostly from the Irish underground. And when I say obscure, I mean some of these artists have fewer YouTube subscribers than I do. Some of them I couldn't even get footage of. How do I know these people are real if I don't get to see them jamming? As such, I feel like it wouldn't be fair to go in depth on each remixer's sound the way I normally would, when many of them currently seem to be in the formative stages of their music careers. Despite the disparate list of collaborators, this collection of remixes is alarmingly coherent and consistent overall. The album kicks off with a remix of YAW, which has been retitled Yawn. This remix is by DJ Molly Rush, who doesn't appear to have done much original production at all from what I can find online, so if this is her first effort, it's pretty damn solid. It starts off with some skating jungle drum patterns, before building into a dystopian hard dance banger. The grizzled post-apocalyptic synths on this remind me quite a bit of happy hardcore, but the vibe is anything but. It's effectively unhappy hardcore. As dance music goes, it's stay the hell away from me music if I've ever heard it. Rather appropriately, several of the other remixes here take a similarly aggressive tact. Even some of the slower ones, like the mid-tempo electro-funk of Lesbo 3001 by Alice Go of the band Dreamwife, sounds like it's trying to rip off your head and use it as an airbag. Compositionally, I think this remix is very effective, even though it's perhaps a little bit breakdown heavy. Although that said, I think the use of space throughout the track does make for an interesting and slightly more subtle composition than you'd normally get from this kind of down-tempo disco. There's also a heavy remix from the wonderfully named Asparagus Montague from the Irish punk rap outfit Post-Punk Podge and the Techno Hippies. As much as his names are a mouthful though, his intensified version of Turf's Out very much just sticks with the title phrase. Which is then repeated over and over on this violently throbbing techno beat like a PSA delivered by a drill sergeant. Can't Fire Me, I'm Raving by Metra has some drum and bass influences in it, and by that I mean it's out and out a drum and bass track. I was initially quite apprehensive about this one, given that it deploys the same basketball snare drum that I've criticised numerous post-pendulum drum and bass artists for.
You can't fire me, I'm leaving!
But even with that in mind, this is one of the most dynamic, headstrong drum and bass compositions I've heard in a long time. It switches to some more Photech style drum patterns at one point. And although it suffers from maybe a few too many breakdowns throughout the track, by the standards of many drum and bass artists, Metra's got a pleasingly full box of tricks on this remix, switching between melodic devices at will, and even at one point throwing in some Sandstorm. I wasn't expecting meme literacy to be a common theme throughout this remix album, but there's actually quite a few other tracks here that occupy similar territory. For example, the squelchy techno of A History of Bad Men Part 3 by Hex Hugh has a manipulated vocal sample on it that sounds like the Pet Shop Boys being thrown down the stairs. Then there's Boy Jr.'s 8-bit electro-punk rework Picture of Wealth that features the classic kid saying yay sound effect. And then the album's closer, Domestic Blissed Out by Milo Smith, takes the Loose Hoover sample from the end of the original and smears it across the beginning of the track to create a cleanliness tornado. Reminds me a lot of the Tens post-punk band Mikachu and the Shapes, who used to perform a song which involves sticking a hoover in their mouth. Does this count as self-censorship? I can't tell. I mention all these elements because the main triumph of this remix collection is it takes the silliness of the band and actually applies it more to their sound than the original does. Probably the most absurd remixes on this collection are the ones where the production goes in a more chill direction. Irish synth-pop duo Beauty Sleep offer an almost Balearic rendition of Big Shout, here renamed Bigger, Shoutier.
More productive.
They throw in some 90s rave piano, some dreamy harp samples, and even their own vocals that are drenched with auto-tune.
We shout out to feel free, so tell me how I should act or who I should be. Don't believe my lies.
I know I mentioned Still Brat earlier, but out of all the remixes here, I think this one would probably fit pretty well on that album. Even further in the chill direction is the U-Lad remix of Pity Bra, here renamed Pity Bra. This track comes halfway through Blouse Clubland, and where the rest of the remixes try to match the punk ethos and aesthetic of Problem Patterns, this one is unashamedly a Kenny G style easy listening jam. Within the context of Blouse Clubland, this is a genius little intermission, but as a standalone track, it's maybe a little too convincing as Muzak goes. What's particularly odd about this track though is it's the only one on the album that doesn't even bother using the vocals and lyrics from the original. In terms of U-Lad's vocals, they basically just seem to be singing about setting fire to a supermarket.
They set fire to far to the sham supermarket.
Which seems to be a far cry from the original's messages about having standards when it comes to throwing lingerie. But this is characteristic of a repeated trend throughout Blouse Clubland, which is, despite how urgent and pointed the lyrics are in the original songs, in many of these remixes they get mucked around with to the point of being obscured or truncated. One repeated tendency of the remixes here, for example, is to whittle Problem Pattern's vocals down to a single word or phrase that is then just forcefully barked out in moments of emphasis. Really, with a lot of these remixes, it's just like they're using the feel of the original vocals rather than the lyrics. In Boy Jr.'s remix, for example, the vocals are arranged into this impenetrable cacophony that sounds like a playground from down the road. Then they go even harder in using the vocals as an instrument when they just start pummeling the keys on a sampler, like they're playing Parappa the Rapper. It works pretty well, but philosophically, I did find myself in this album wondering if such remixing serves to sanitize the message of punk. As the album's title suggests, this is largely a dance album, and often with club music it's much more about the feel of the vocals than what's being said per se. So chopping up Problem Pattern's lyrics and using them as more of an aesthetic garnish does kinda make sense. And yet, on a few occasions with this album, I did find myself thinking, God, I wish they'd just use a little bit more of the lyrics on this remix. And yet, maybe there is something to be said for keeping the message just slightly out of sight. The alternative hip-hop group Dialect, for example, have many tracks where their vocals are drowned out by ear-splitting sheets of noise. But it doesn't make their messages any less urgent or important. And to be fair, there are a few remixes on this album that do largely preserve the original songwriting. Compared to the more echoey vocals of most of the remixes, Metra's drum and bass version actively seems to mix them louder at the beginning.
Your writings and traditions have always been viewed in light of reason and experience, but of only a few.
In terms of both preserving the lyrics and taking the production in a new direction, I'd say Macy Rodman's version of Who We Do Not Save is probably the most successful. Initially it sort of reminded me of indie dance staples from the 90s like EMF or Jesus Jones, but the sounds here go way too hard for that, with drums that sound like pallets dropping and a pterodactyl squawk. And with Problem Pattern's vocals over it, it ultimately comes across closer to someone like Rage Against the Machine. Rodman also adds her own guest vocals to the mix, providing her own perspective on the failure of corporatized healthcare, and adding a nice variation of tone and perspective throughout the track that makes this a really well-rounded remix. Another remix that pulls this off effectively is Hex Hughes' History of Bad Men Part 3, adding new verses that bring even more anecdotes of douchebag behaviour to the pot.
Always underestimated, never trusted, thought to be lacking. But yes, I know how to plug my fucking jacket!
At the prettier end of the remixes here, you've got Hello, You're Through to Beats Club, which is a remix of Advertising Services by Pink Pound, which goes for a fairly straightforward electro clash beat, simple but fun, and with some surprisingly relaxing synth chords over the top.
The rich ranking billions, hoarding the wealth, they're economically distancing from everyone else.
Distracto's remix of Poverty Tourist Board also has some harmonic fervour, despite riding a mangled techno beat that sounds like Mandy Indiana at their most stompy. It's another one where the vocals are somewhat obscured, sounding like they're coming from an answering machine in the adjacent room, but my word, does the drama on this one sound massive. Sonically though, pretty much every track offers a significant departure from the original, with the one that sounds the closest being the closing remix from Milo Smith, whose ironically titled Domestic Blissed Out lays some strident break beats over the original guitar drones. and to be honest, it does end up feeling like a little bit of a mismatch. Compared to the other remixes throughout that largely handle structure pretty well, this one seems a bit perplexed by the loose doom metal trajectory of the original, and ultimately opts to just plough on through it. There are a few good moments in this remix, particularly when a more jungle snare pattern comes in towards the end. But as the closing track on this album, it ultimately results in a somewhat unconfident conclusion. So, that is Blouse Clubland. For my money, one of the finest remix albums that came out in 2024, and one of the few that genuinely works well as a start-to-finish listening experience. In terms of whether this album achieved my ideal of post-punk, maybe not quite. But that said, I was watching Todd in the Shadow's review of Billy Idol's Cyberpunk recently, and at the end of it he said that
maybe Billy Idol wasn't the best person to bring it to people's stereos, but Cyberpunk is absolutely the music we need in 2018.
And given that the vibes here are largely techno, industrial and drum and bass, but with significant overlap between them, then I think this offers up a surprising and unlikely realisation of the cyberpunk sound. And although I think maybe the messaging of Problem Patterns originals loses a little bit in translation in these new forms, at the very least the anger, the urgency, and even the silliness is still intact. Favourite remix on this album is the Macy Rodman one. For me, it's the most strongly self-contained remix here. And even if sonically it does allude to some of the more awkward bits of 90s detritus, it does so in a way that makes such music seem actually like a good idea. Least favourite remix for me is the closing one from Milo Smith. It's perhaps the most punk in terms of its attitude towards throwing the elements together, but even though that's thematically appropriate, in practice it just feels a little too slapdash for me, although it's certainly not without its highlights. And is this collection of remixes better than the original? Well, this one is a classic mostly but album for me, in that I enjoyed the sonic variety of the remix collection more than the somewhat fixed palette of the original, but the directness, the songwriting, and even some of the riffs of the original make it also a very worthy album, and one not to be missed. Anyway, that's my review. Please let me know if you've heard either of these albums and what you thought about them. Do you agree with my opinions, disagree with my opinions? Let me know in the comments below. Also let me know if there's any remix albums or EPs you think I should be reviewing in the future, and please do subscribe to the channel if you want to know when those have been made. Thank you very much for watching. This review is over.